In the summer of 1947, something fell from the sky over the high desert outside Roswell, New Mexico. The government said it was a weather balloon. Then they changed the story. Then they changed it again. But for 42 years, one man stayed quiet. His name was Chester Alroy Mabon. He was a field recovery specialist with the 509th Bomb Group. And in 1989, dying of pancreatic cancer, he sat down in front of a camera and described in careful, unhurried detail exactly what he saw in that debris field. He said he had nothing left to lose. That interview has never been broadcast. Until now. The first thing Chester Mabon says before any question is even asked is this: they weren't human. Not injured, not disoriented, not the pilots of some experimental Soviet aircraft, some classified prototype, some balloon array carrying atmospheric sensors. Not human. That's where he starts. That's the foundation on which everything else in the interview rests. And the further I went into this recording, the more I understood why he chose to begin there. Because everything else, every logistical detail, every procedural anomaly, every bureaucratic impossibility in the chain of events that followed, everything else only makes sense if you accept that opening statement as true. So let's start where Mabon started. At the contact itself, he describes arriving at the secondary debris field, not the primary scatter zone that rancher Mac Brazel had already reported, but a second location approximately 3 miles to the southeast. One that, according to every official account I've been able to cross-reference, does not exist. There is no secondary site in the Army Air Force's own recovered documentation. No secondary site in the 1994 Air Force report. No secondary site anywhere in the publicly acknowledged record. And yet, Mabon describes it in extraordinary detail. The ground was depressed, he says, not cratered, depressed, as though something had come down slowly, deliberately, and settled. The brush was flattened outward in a radial pattern for perhaps 60 feet. There was no fire, no burning, no smell of fuel or propellant. In a crash site. Think about what that means. No fire. He says the craft, and he uses that word deliberately, pausing before it, choosing it over object or wreckage. The craft was largely intact on the eastern side, partially collapsed on the west. He estimated it at somewhere between 30 and 40 feet in diameter. Disc-shaped. The surface, he says, had a quality he struggled to describe. Not metallic exactly, not smooth in the way metal is smooth. More like, and here he searches for the word, integrated. As though the material had no seams, no rivets, no panels, no evidence of assembly. As though it had grown into its shape rather than been constructed into it. This raises a simple but critical question. What material, in 1947, or in any year before or since, could be fabricated into a 30-foot structure without a single seam or join? The aerospace engineers I consulted, speaking off the record, 2 of them with decades of experience in advanced composite materials, said simply that they didn't know of one. Didn't know of one. In 2024, 77 years after Mabon is standing in that field describing it. Mabon describes being directed by a senior officer, a man he identifies only as the colonel, and whom he pointedly refuses to name even in 1989, even dying, to approach the eastern side of the craft where a section of the hull had been compromised. Not explosively, not violently. It was opened, he says, whether by the impact or by whatever process governed the craft's own internal systems, he cannot say. But it was open, and he was ordered inside. He goes quiet here. In the recording, there's a pause of nearly 40 seconds. 40 seconds of silence that the interviewer, a retired investigative journalist named Paul Safarian, does not attempt to fill. To his credit, because what Mabon says when he finally speaks again is this: there were 3 of them. 2 were gone. 1 was not. Gone. Not dead. Gone. He is careful about this distinction. He does not say they were dead. He does not say he saw bodies. He says 2 of them were gone, and the 3rd was not. When Safarian asks him to clarify, Mabon says, "Gone means gone, the way you go when something ends, And then he describes the third. Small, that's the first word he uses. Small in a way that registered as wrong, he says. Not childlike small, not diminutive, but structurally small, as though built on a principle of compactness rather than reduction. He estimated 3.5, perhaps 4 feet in height. The head, and he emphasizes the proportional strangeness, was large relative to the body. Not grotesquely so, not like a caricature. Proportionally unusual in the way that a question is unusual. You notice it immediately and you cannot stop noticing it. The skin was a colour he describes as not grey. I want to stop on that phrasing because it matters. Not grey, he is explicitly, consciously rejecting the descriptor that has become, in popular culture, the default for this kind of account. He says it was closer to the colour of something that had never been exposed to sunlight. A biological pallor with an undertone he couldn't name. The eyes were large, the mouth was small. There were no visible ears, no hair. The hands, and he is precise here, precise in a way that suggests he has rehearsed this specific detail many times in private. The hands had 4 fingers. Long, without the bulbous tips of human fingers, tapered, like something designed for a purpose he couldn't identify. The being was alive. Moving? He pauses again. Not moving, he says, but alive. There was something happening, a quality of presence, of active interiority, that he recognized as the signature of a living mind. He'd seen death before. He'd seen it many times. This was not death. And that's where the encounter becomes impossible to set aside. What Mauban describes in the minutes following his entry into the craft is, in some ways, more disturbing than the being itself. He says that within approximately 10 minutes of his unit arriving at the secondary site, 2 additional vehicles appeared from the north. Not military vehicles he recognized, not standard army issue. Black, unmarked, driven by men in civilian clothes who nevertheless moved and organized themselves with the precision of a military unit. Who directed Mauban and his colleagues back, firmly, without explanation. Who established a perimeter, not around the crash site, but around them. Around the recovery team, as though the team itself had become the thing that needed to be contained. Why? Why contain the witnesses? Mauban and his colleagues were held at that perimeter for what he estimates as 6 hours. They were given water. They were not given food. They were not permitted to speak to one another. They were interviewed one at a time by a man Mauban describes as quiet in a way that meant something. A man who asked very calmly and very specifically exactly what each of them had seen, in what sequence, and whether they had touched anything inside the craft. And when each man answered, the quiet man wrote nothing down. Nothing. He listened, asked occasional follow-up questions, and wrote nothing down. No record, no documentation, no carbon copies. The deeper I went into the procedural history of the 509th Bomb Group's activities in July 1947, the more this absence crystallized into something that felt deliberate. Other incidents from this period, training accidents, equipment failures, medical emergencies, generated paper, inevitable, redundant, bureaucratic paper, the kind that militaries produce reflexively, almost unconsciously. And yet for the 3 days following July 4th, 1947, there is a gap in the 509th's administrative record that a historian at the University of New Mexico, reviewing the archive in 2001, described to me as structurally anomalous. Her words, not mine. Structurally anomalous. After 6 hours, Mauban and the team were loaded onto a transport and taken to Roswell Army Airfield. They were separated into individual rooms, not cells, rooms. Comfortable, he says, almost pointedly comfortable, with magazines and coffee and a window. A window that looked out onto the tarmac where Mauban watched over the course of the following morning. A series of cargo containers being loaded onto an aircraft he identified as a C-54 Skymaster. The containers were wooden, military standard construction. But the handling was unusual. The men moving them wore gloves, heavy ones, not standard issue, and they moved the containers in a manner he describes as careful in a specific direction, meaning they were cautious about one axis of movement, one orientation, as though the contents had a quality that responded to position. What does that mean? What cargo requires positional caution? Liquid, obviously. Sensitive instrumentation, possibly. But Mabon had seen sensitive instrumentation loaded. He'd seen it many times. This was different. The caution, he says, felt biological. Where that aircraft went, Mabon never learned, or says he never learned. He was released the following day with a set of verbal instructions he describes as clear and complete. He was not to speak of what he had seen. He was not to write it down. He was not to contact other members of his unit about the events of the previous days. He was told that a cover explanation had been prepared and that his cooperation with that explanation was expected. He was told this once. He was not asked whether he understood. It was assumed he cooperated. For 42 years he cooperated, and then he sat down in front of Paul Safarian's camera. Safarian recorded 8 hours of interview over 2 days in April 1989 at Mabon's home in Tucson, Arizona. The recordings were made on standard VHS cassette. Safarian retained copies in a storage unit in Albuquerque and gave a second set to a woman he identified in his notes only as MV, a contact presumably trusted, whose full identity Safarian apparently chose not to commit to paper. Safarian died in 1994 of a heart attack. Mabon died in July 1989, 3 months after the interview. The tapes passed through several hands. This much I've been able to establish through Safarian's correspondence, portions of which are held at the Special Collections Archive at the University of Arizona. The tapes were referenced in a 1991 letter from Safarian to a colleague in which he described their contents as the most consequential thing I have ever been near. The colleague's response, if there was one, is not in the archive. What I have are transcripts, partial transcripts prepared by Safarian himself, covering roughly 40% of the total interview. How those transcripts came to circulate in the small community of serious Roswell researchers is itself a story with too many gaps to tell cleanly. But they circulated, and once you read them, once you sit with the specific texture of what Mabon describes, the involuntary precision of a man excavating a memory he has suppressed for 4 decades, the pattern that emerges is not easy to dismiss. Because here's the thing about authentic testimony. It has the wrong details in it. Fabricated accounts tend toward the cinematically coherent. They hit the expected beats. They produce the expected imagery. What Mabon produces is different. He keeps returning to peripheral things. The quality of the light that morning. A smell he couldn't identify. Not unpleasant, but persistent, like something electrical, but organic. The sound, or rather the absence of sound, inside the craft. He says that inside the craft his own breathing sounded different. He couldn't explain this, he doesn't try to. That quality of involuntary observation, the noticing of things that don't support any particular narrative, that just happened and lodged, that is the signature of actual experience. At least that's the argument. And it's not an argument I make lightly, or without reservations, but once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The official explanation for Roswell has been revised 3 times. First, a flying disc, the Army Air Force's own press release, issued July 8, 1947, before someone evidently thought better of it. Then, a weather balloon. Then, in 1994, a research balloon from Project Mogul, a classified program designed to monitor Soviet nuclear tests. Each explanation was presented with the confidence of finality, each one quietly superseded. Here's what the official explanation cannot account for. The secondary debris site that Mabon describes, a location with no documentation, no acknowledgement, no footprint in any declassified record, was referenced independently by 2 other individuals. a retired nurse named Dorothy Calloway, interviewed in 1985 by a researcher working under a university grant, described overhearing a conversation between two officers at the Roswell Base Hospital in which a southern field site was mentioned in connection with material that needed different handling. And a former communications technician named Ray Escovedo, in a handwritten statement discovered among his effects after his death in 1997, referred to routing a signal on the night of July 4th to a site whose grid coordinates placed it precisely 3 miles southeast of the primary debris zone. Not coincidentally, not approximately, precisely. The pattern repeats with a regularity that becomes difficult to attribute to coincidence. 3 independent sources, 3 different decades, 3 different points of entry into the same coordinates, and not one of them in any official document acknowledged. The silence that followed the 1989 interview is its own form of evidence. Safarian, by his own account in his correspondence, submitted a query to 3 separate network news divisions about the tapes. He received 2 form rejections and 1 response from a senior producer whose name appears in Safarian's notes that he describes as a conversation that made me understand this would not be going anywhere. He doesn't elaborate. He doesn't need to. What does it take to stop a story in 1989? It takes someone deciding it should be stopped. That's it. That's all. And that decision leaves a shape, a negative space that you can see clearly if you know where to look. Safarian knew where to look. He spent the last 5 years of his life looking. He found no takers. He found no platform. He found, in his own words, a wall that had no door in it. There is a section of the transcript I keep returning to. Mabon is describing his time in the craft. He has described the being. He has described the physical space, the interior, which he says was lit without any visible source of light, evenly, as though the walls themselves were faintly luminescent. He has described the smell, the sound. And then Safarian asks him a question that I suspect Safarian had been building toward for the entire interview. Did it communicate with you? And Mabon takes a long time, and then he says, not in words. He says he doesn't know how to describe what happened in the approximately 3 minutes he spent in proximity to the being before the men in civilian clothes arrived and moved him back. He says it wasn't telepathy, not in the science fiction sense. It was more like a shift in his understanding, like suddenly knowing something he hadn't known before without being able to trace the path by which he came to know it. He says he's thought about this for 42 years. He says he still doesn't have language for it. What did he understand? What was the content of this wordless communication? He hesitates, and then he says that it was surprised, that it hadn't expected to survive, and that it was waiting for something. Waiting for something. Not reaching for anything. Not attempting to communicate further. Not afraid. Waiting. With a quality of patience, Mabon says that didn't feel biological. That felt older than biology. Older than waiting itself. I don't know what to do with that. I'm not sure Mabon knew what to do with it either, but I notice that it's the only moment in the transcript where his language completely fails him, where a man who has been articulate and controlled for hours suddenly sounds lost. And there is something in that lostness that functions, at least for me, as a kind of authentication. Chester Mabon died on July 19th, 1989, 42 years, almost to the day, after he stood in a depressed circle of flattened brush in the New Mexico high desert and looked at something that the official record insists was never there. Paul Safarian spent the following 5 years trying to place the story. He could not. He died in 1994. His files went to the University of Arizona. The tapes, the full 8 hours of recorded testimony, have not surfaced in any archive, public or private, that I've been able to locate. MV, whoever she is, has not come forward. The cargo from that unmarked C-54 went somewhere. Someone knows where. The evidence taken together points towards something considerably larger than a balloon. Taken together, the secondary site with no documentation, The men in civilian clothes who arrived before any official team, the 6 hours of enforced silence, the zero paperwork, the independently corroborated coordinates, the partial transcripts that circulated for years in communities that take this seriously, taken together, it forms a shape. Not a proof. Shapes aren't proofs, but they're not nothing either. And what I keep returning to, what I cannot get past, is the being. Waiting. Mabon's word. Not dying, not struggling, not communicating in any conventional sense. Waiting. For something or someone that, as far as we know, never came. Does that something, that someone, know what happened? Do they know where that C-54 landed? Do they know what became of the containers? Do they understand that the being who waited did not ultimately survive the wait? And is it possible, is it even possible, that somewhere in a facility with no name on any public document, in a room built without a door that could be found, what Mabon saw that morning is not gone, but stored, studied, held against the moment someone decides we're ready? Chester Mabon waited 42 years to speak. Paul Safarian spent 5 years trying to make sure someone heard him. The tapes are gone, or hidden, or held, or burned, depending on who you ask and how much you trust the asking. What I know is this. A man with nothing to lose described something he saw. He described it carefully, consistently, with the involuntary precision of someone reporting a memory rather than constructing a story. He described beings. He described contact. He described a moment of wordless understanding that he never in 4 decades found the language to fully translate. And then he died, and the tapes disappeared, and the secondary site remained unacknowledged, and the coordinates stayed empty. And the official explanation held. What knowledge died with Chester Mabon? What understanding about what they are, where they're from, why they came, whether the waiting one was eventually retrieved or simply lost? What understanding passed out of human possession in that 42-year silence? What did we have access to for those few minutes in that craft that we squandered through fear and classification and the bureaucratic instinct to contain? What do we not know now that we once briefly, accidentally, incompletely knew? What is still waiting?